So we know that racism needs to be tackled, not only on an individual level, but on a systematic level as well. Structural racism exists, and the world is designed to perpetuate that. To dismantle racist structures, we need to articulate what those structures look like in our context. And that's really what we hope to do in today's conversation. But one of the things that I'd really like to emphasize is that I hope that today's conversation is really going to galvanize just our thoughts and some of the conversations that we have in our workplaces around what racist structures might look like in our organizations and really what impact we can have in changing those progressively over the years. So I'd like to thank all of you for joining today. If you haven't done already, please can we request that you place yourselves on mute throughout the session, and that's just really to enable the call quality to be fantastic. And I'm also conscious that a number of us are still working from home. Some of us have had children sent home because classes have been closed, etc. So it's really just to protect this space. I'd also like you to please, if you have any questions or feel you may have any questions during today's session that you'd like to pose to the panelists, if you could please go to www.slido and then type the code #CorndelEDI to submit questions to our panelists. And we've made it really easy for you, so you can just take a picture now of this barcode and it will take you directly to that website where you'll just need to type the hashtag in to be able to start submitting your questions. If you've come to the session with some burning questions already, please do feel free to start adding those in. And once we finish the initial discussion, we will hopefully have some time to go through some of those questions for you today. We will endeavour to answer as many of those, and we'll also share the write-up of today's session with those of you that are on the call. And we will be posting kind of a LinkedIn post about today's session and some of the key takeaways. Okay, so I'm conscious that I didn't even introduce myself. So just to introduce myself, my name is Grace Masuro. I am the Stakeholder Engagement Lead for the Corndel Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Task Force. I'm delighted to be joined today by some amazing leaders from a range of organisations to speak on today's topic. So this is our panel. So we've got Kim Kiesk, we've got Shazan Herjani. Sorry, that is a spelling error. Shazan Herji, Shaz, please forgive me. Rosemary Davidson Gotobed and Sylvana Story. Kim joins us from Equal Plus Limited, where she's an associate, but she's also a managing director and executive coach of her own business. Shez is our director of curriculum and assessment at Corndel, and Rosemary Gotobed is the National Minority Ethnic Vocations Officer at the Archbishop's Council. And finally, Sylvana Story is Chief Executive at Global Organisational Integrators. So thank you all so much for being here today. Today, we're going to be discussing how we create a workplace that looks and feels anti-racist. I'm just going to go back to the initial slide for anyone that's joining slightly later so you know how to kind of get involved today. So when we say anti-racist, we mean consciously making efforts and taking actions to provide equitable opportunities for all people on an individual and systematic level. So really how we as individuals can impact change, and we're going to pose some questions to the panelists where we'll get their experiences and their thoughts on this topic, and we will also leave you with some tips from the panelists of how you can affect change in your organisations and in your roles going forward. So the panel discussion is going to begin now. So I'm going to be posing some questions to our panelists, and I will call on the panelists individually just so everyone has an opportunity to answer these questions for you. So starting first of all with question one. So what challenges have you, and I'm going to pose this question to you, Shez, if you don't mind. What challenges have you found in articulating or highlighting what racist structures look like in your context?
Good afternoon. Yeah, thank you, Grace. So I think this is a really interesting question. And the key to this question is, what do they look like in my context? Racist structures to me are any structures that bring about racist outcomes. So they can look very different depending on the organization or the business you're in. And part of this is asking the question that we posed that entitles this panel discussion is, what does an anti-racist workplace look like? So I kind of thought about this and I thought, well, I take an analogy. What do I think about the word anti-racist? I take an analogy and I think about the word antiseptic. Well, antiseptic is something that gets rid of an infection, gets rid of something bad we don't want. And I thought, could you have a non-septic substance? So you could have antiseptic, you could have an infection, and you could have a non-septic substance. And would that mean you could have a non-racist and an anti-racist workplace? And would there be a difference between them? And I kind of think there wouldn't be, because if you are a non-racist workplace, then you are still reflecting the racist structures present in society. So I guess for me, a racist workplace is any workplace that doesn't implement specific structures to combat racism.
Excellent. Thank you, Shez. Kim, how would you answer that question? So just to repeat it, what challenges have you found in articulating or highlighting what racist structures look like in your context?
Thanks, Grace. Lovely to be here as well. So a while ago, I think it was Aquila from Cornell posted a really excellent diagram on LinkedIn, which was about becoming anti-racist. And it showed 3 different zones. So there was a fear zone, a learning zone, and a growth zone. And that really kind of highlighted my awareness with regard to creating an anti-racist workplace. So in the last organisation I worked in, I was there for 9 years. I think for many years we patted ourselves on the back because we thought we were a really diverse workplace. We had 33 different nationalities working there. We had diverse people working within the business. And I think we were very much in the fear zone because we didn't really ask ourselves any hard questions. We felt very comfortable with where we were. And it wasn't until we had a couple of really serious incidents that happened that we started to look at ourselves and move towards the learning zone. So to look at our privilege, to become more vulnerable and look at our knowledge gaps as well. And, 33 nationalities is great, but if they're mostly from European countries, that's not actually very diverse. We hadn't really looked at our BAME pay gap and, was there representation of diverse people at all levels within the business? I think that could definitely be improved. So, to become an anti-racist workplace is a great thing, but it takes really hard work and you really need to start to change the culture of your organisation and start to really listen and take into consideration minority voices.
Brilliant, thank you, Kim. I think that's really valid as well. I think one of the things that a number of organisations that I've spoken to recently have noted as well is doing that tough piece of work around actually looking within the business and asking those questions. What does our organisation look like? Rosemary, I'd like to pose the same question to you, please. What challenges have you found in articulating or highlighting what racist structures look like in your context?
Again, thank you for your welcome and the opportunity to be part of this illustrious panel. My context actually stretches back I've been doing this kind of work for the past 30 years. So the context has changed. But what I've noticed is that there has been a consistency in theme. And the consistency in theme is the way that resistance morphs to accommodate itself. So Shez was talking very helpfully about antiseptic and the purpose of an antiseptic. My experience and challenge has been that humans will do things and maintain things that actually harm them as long as it maintains their advantage. So we see this in various aspects of society and politics, where we're like, why would you vote against, for example, in the States, why would so many poor white people vote against a health bill that would help them? And they do that because they've been told that if this thing comes into being, poor and disadvantaged Black and brown people will benefit. So there's an acknowledgement, there needs to be an acknowledgement, and sometimes there's a resistance of that what we're dealing with, of sometimes the people who will do something that will in long term harm them, as long as they maintain their advantage. So having that very, not the first point of question, but what do you do? What are the 3 or 4 small steps before that main question? So it's naming that there is resistance and there will be resistance, even if it doesn't, even if it works against you, as long as people maintain their advantage. So there is that element. But there is also the element of things hiding in plain sight, and the challenge of denial. Oh, it's not that, it's this, or you're overreacting, or you have a chip on your shoulder, or you misinterpreted, or yes, you're upset, but I didn't mean it. These are the little, very subtle ways of resistance that is a challenge to creating an anti-racist anti-racist atmosphere where everybody belongs and everybody thrives. So those are just the few things that came up for me with answering these questions, but I'm sure as we go along, we'll unpack a few more.
Definitely. Thank you, Rosemary. And finally, Silvana, your thoughts on challenges that you've experienced in articulating what racist structures look like in your context, please.
Hi, and good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me onto the panel as well, Grace. It's very much along the lines of what Rosemary just spoke about, actually. So just to say for context, I am a business psychologist. So a lot of my work around the diversity and racism inclusion space comes from a psychological, is framed within a psychological background. So for me, racism, the one big problem we have is that it's not overt, it's covert. And so it lies right beneath the surface, which is very difficult to unearth, to reveal, to expose. And also it's deeply ingrained into those systems. So be it the structural systems such as racial hierarchies, or talent management systems such as recruitment or promotion or appraisals. These systems are very much protected by the ruling elite. So they're very, very difficult to break down. And the third thing for me really is that no one wants to talk about it. So this is where I link into Rosemary, is that people are inherently fearful of having those uncomfortable conversations or even calling out actions that might be uncomfortable. And therefore, it's very rare that it will be brought up. Even when they are called out, most people don't practice what I call active listening. So they won't actually hear what is being said. So for me, the whole behavior around racism and the habits that are fundamental to racism need to be changed.
Brilliant. Thank you, Silvana. Really powerful. just roundup of that question and your thoughts. So moving on to question 2 now. People's relationships with racism is deeply personal, and it's traditionally personal because of your race. What role do you feel employers, business leaders and managers play in people's relationship with racism? And I'd like to start with you, Kim, if you could please give us your thoughts on that question.
So my background's in HR, and I think this is the moment for HR professionals to really step up and using their influence to make sure that that a holistic approach is taken to creating an anti-racist organisation. So starting to embed this feeling in an organisation's mission, in its HR practices and the behaviours that it values within that organisation, and moving towards a safe and speak up culture. So people feeling comfortable enough to have open conversations. And I think this goes both ways. So minority voices being confident speaking up and knowing that they'll have fair treatment, but also people not from minorities who, part of racism comes from ignorance and curiosity. So people feeling comfortable enough to speak up, to want to learn and to understand as well, and to start filling in those knowledge gaps. And then I guess my last point would be to develop a culture of inclusive leadership, because it's the leaders at the top of the organisation who are really setting the tone to create an anti-racist organisation. So expecting those leaders to support inclusion, because they're the ones that are going to have the power to influence.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kim. Silvana, what are your thoughts on people's relationships with racism and the role that employers and business leaders and managers play in that?
So whenever I see something in an organization work or not work, it's purely based on the leadership behaviors. So for me, the leaders are the architects of their culture. And so they have responsibility for shaping that culture. And D&I, or racism lies at the heart. Therefore, they have the responsibility and commitment for positioning, supporting, facilitating, and so forth, integrating. And if they can use their privilege and power to progress and take a stand, that makes a huge difference, because it will create a psychologically safe environment. Speaking truth to power is okay, and so forth. If they can communicate with empathy and act with compassion, that also helps.
Brilliant. Thank you, Silvana. Rosemary, what are your thoughts on this question?
I fully endorse what both Kim and Silvana are saying. I think those things are really crucial. In addition to that, I would say that there is a lot to be said for not just saying your support, but being that place, demonstrating that with your actions. So one of the questions I tend to ask with leadership of organizations is how are you putting this into practice by what you do? What's your succession plan? Who are the people that you are identifying and streamlining? If your leadership doesn't reflect your larger workforce, how are you ensuring that by either being conscious about bringing on senior people who are who give a bit more of a reflection of your organization, or how are you identifying people within those organizations and encouraging them, mentoring them to work their way up and work their way into more management and leadership roles. There's a thing also which is definitely connected in this, is this conversation about racism being a personal thing, that people take this on personally. That's only good if folk do not equate racism with being a good or not a good person. That we're talking about structures, powers, and I was going to say principalities, but that's not what I mean. But so this is the sense that we're talking about structures, and that these structures morph and rearrange themselves to maintain the status quo. that not mean that that will happen regardless, unless you are vigilant. So it's not about being a good person or a bad person, but are you vigilant enough to identify what is going on and how we all participate in maintaining a status quo, even if it works against us, either by our silence or by our passive or active participation. It's great to have things like policy and procedures that say this is who we are as an organization, this is what good looks like, and that's why we support it, that's why we endorse it, and that's why we do our business how we do it. That's why we identify, progress people, get people up through the organization, and be intentional about the leadership looking like the wider body of an organization. And that takes a lot of time. And it's not just one project or process. It's not doing, it's living and being.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rosemary. And finally, Shez, over to you, please.
Thank you. Yeah, look, I absolutely agree with what the panel said. And looking at the question again, it says, people's relationship with racism is deeply personal. So just to comment on that, I think that's absolutely right. We've all had different experiences in our lives, and we've all got different personal histories, and we understand different things by language, by the same words in our language. And some of these words can be deeply offensive and be seen as overtly racist to some of us, and they may not be to others. And one example is different language that's acceptable over here in the UK and not acceptable in America and the other way around. So I think, given that we all have a different appreciation of what racism is, and people have grown up in different generations and different cultures, I think the responsibility of organisations is to foster a conversation, an open conversation with the focus on education and understanding and sharing these different personal stories. And we can only do that if we can create a safe space where people are allowed to make mistakes within limits, and you can say something that's wrong, not because you mean to offend someone, but because you're exploring whether it is wrong and why it's wrong, and you're trying. So I think we can create these safe spaces in organisations. Then I think that's part of the responsibility of an organisation. One, to generate conversations, to let us understand racism. And I think the other responsibility of employers is, to echo my fellow panelists, is to achieve a diverse outcomes, and in particular amongst senior levels of management. And I think so many people have come up against glass ceilings, and not just in terms of ethnicity, in terms of all sorts of gender inequality, disability. And I think we have to shift the emphasis now to outcomes rather than, we need good processes to get there, but I think accountability has to come in the form of outcomes now as well. So that's definitely a responsibility of employers.
Brilliant. Thank you, Shez. Okay, so our next question really looks at specifically the sectors or companies that you work for. So I'd like to ask each of you what your vision for your company or sector's fight against racism is. And I'd like to start with you, Silvana, please.
Okay, so I'm an odd one because I'm a consultant and I work across a variety of sectors. And so my vision applies to, it's very broad and yet it's specific. So I have a vision where we all behave with dignity, where the full expression of humanity is valued. And it's based on an African philosophy actually called Ubuntu. Which is a person is only a person through other persons. We need to stop framing racism as a debate. Racism is not entertainment, it's evident. So we need to really pull ourselves together, pull our what makes us human together, make D&I a much more human-centered approach. That would be my vision for fight against racism.
Amazing. Thank you, Silvana. Rosemary, what are your thoughts on your vision for your sector in their fight against racism?
Sorry, I'm giggling. I'm smiling because the idea of the Church of England being a sector, which I suppose in one sense, yeah, in one sense, that's fair enough. But ditto with everything that Silvana said. I think that's really powerful. But with regard to the Church of England or faith groups as a whole, to be the lead on this, I feel that there is a lot of within faith groups, there's a lot of following what's happening with society rather than valuing valuing the teaching of the importance of humanity and being a people's together with all its diversities. And there's a lot of work that's already been done and been doing around this. And there are a lot of people who have been and are working very hard to instill that generation after generation. But it is for this piece of work, these conversations, not to be fetishized or projects based on this is a project and we've done that, let's move on to the next shiny thing. And let's remain relevant, and whatever society says is the next shiny thing, let's follow that. Stick to the principles, stick to the pillars of what we believe, and speak truth through that, not just in words but in actions as well.
Brilliant, thank you. And Kim, thinking about the companies and sectors that you consult for, what would your vision be overall for their fight against racism?
So I'm also working as a consultant, and I work quite closely with this company called Equal Plus, which is a diversity consultancy. And together we've put together a 7-step approach to create an inclusive culture, which you could apply to whatever sector you're working with. And just to briefly tell you a little bit about that, because it's very practical. Number one, go into an organization and get the data. So what is the organizational context, and start getting information through focus groups and survey just to see where you are in terms of the path towards becoming anti-racist. And then secondly, developing an inclusive culture. So as I mentioned before, you know, what does your mission statement say? Are you a speak up type culture? Do you have inclusive leadership? Then moving on to recruitment, I think Silvana mentioned, you know, there's lots of areas for improvement with recruitment. So are you filtering out ethnic minorities? Do you have recruitment role models to inspire minorities to join your organization? Do you have a really robust succession plan that encourages minority people to progress within the organization? And then training is really, really vital, not only increasing line manager self-awareness, but offering coaching and mentoring to minorities as well to strengthen their confidence. Employee relations, how are you dealing with employee incidents? And then motivation and morale. Company engagement improves so massively when an effort is made to improve diversity and inclusion. So setting up employee resource groups. And then finally, compensation and benefits. So what is your BAME pay gap? Having a look at that, but also reinforcing inclusive behaviours and rewarding people against demonstrating those.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kim. Thank you all for your answers to that question. I think there are so many individuals on this call from a range of organisations, and I'm hoping that, you know, there are some great things that you've taken away from that. So our final question, what part can we as individuals play in creating an anti-racist workplace? And we'd love to get your thoughts on this question, particularly because I'm conscious that everyone that's joined today is actually really keen for some tips on how to do this. So I'd like to start with you, Rosemary, please. What are your thoughts?
Sorry.
Rosemary?
Yep, I'm here. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Right,
Yes.
excellent. Okay, so ways to increase diversity. Be very aware about where you recruit and what networks you are dipping into. If you fish in the same pond, you're going to get the same fish. And sort of think, where are we not? Who do we not know about? What are the other networks that are out there? How can we be part of that? And show our intentionality, that we're not just dipping in to tick a box and say, oh, we're part of this network and that network, but we are here because we want to get the best of the best to be in our organization. That's something that, so I try to encourage dioceses to do that. Think about where you're recruiting from and the networks that you hold, and where your recommendations are coming from, and what else is out there. So sometimes you may not have the answers to that around the immediate table, but we have all these other social networks through LinkedIn and other places as well, where you could throw that question out there. If you're an architect, or if you're into construction, for example, apparently last year there's a group that launched itself on LinkedIn, I think it was, who gather together Black people who are involved in construction, and of all various different skill levels and specialities. I just thought it was just really interesting, because if you gather, because there are lots of these groups where people are gathered together, and it's about asking, if you don't know, there must be somebody you know who does know, and to keep asking those questions. What are we missing here? Where can we find it? And throw the question out broader than the folks sitting around the table, which could be a network thing, a HR thing, and your own wider networks. These things are really important, but it's also important to throw that net out.
Definitely. Thank you, Rosemary. Shez, what are your thoughts? How can we as individuals, or what part can we as individuals play in creating an anti-racist workplace?
Yeah, so I think this echoes a lot of the sentiments we've heard today. It's about asking the questions, pointing out racist structures or incidents when you see them, creating dialogue and places where colleagues can exchange and share experiences. And I think creating those safe places is key to that. And part of it may be to understand what's already happening in your organisation, and trying to fit in around initiatives that are already taking place. But it's difficult to give generic advice, I think, because I'm very privileged to work for an organisation that's really risen to the challenge, and so where I feel we can challenge and ask difficult questions, perhaps may not always be possible in other organisations, but I think it's certainly worth taking a step back and asking yourself if you feel you can ask those difficult questions, and sometimes there can be a lot of pressure. So it's making those assessments as to when and how to ask those difficult questions is key. But I certainly think we can all start the conversation and start the exchange of information and stories amongst our colleagues.
Excellent, thank you, Shez. Kim, what are your thoughts?
Well, a few points here. So first of all, as individuals, just really reading up on the subject. There's so many great books out there which help you kind of understand racist structures and how to speak up as well. So Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, I think, is a great book. That was a real eye-opener for me. And also this book, Speak Up, by Megan Wright. She was speaking at the CIPD annual conference last week and did a great talk about speaking up, not just about racism, but when you see things which are wrong, it could be to do with health and safety. Speak up, because I think in our culture, it's almost seen to be a little impolite if you speak up and point things up, but just being brave enough to do that. But also, if you see a microaggression, being strong enough to say something, and it's not just well, I guess this could be described as microaggressions, but if you're given a pay rise and you know that your minority colleagues haven't, if you're offered a project opportunity that hasn't been offered to others, if you've been given a pay rise or selected for developmental promotion which hasn't been fairly open to other people, I think it's your responsibility as a decent human being to speak up and say something.
Absolutely, thank you, Kim. Over to you, Silvana. What part do you think we can play here?
Well, I think for me overall, we need to stop tiptoeing around certain conversations to protect each other, really. And I'm very much a provocateur, so forgive me if I rattle a few a few cages. But I mean, one of the things that we don't talk about is that in order for someone to succeed, someone has to step away. Right? There's a fable around change, and diversity and inclusion is a change process. There's a fable around it that we have to that we can just change our behaviors. Well, for diversity and inclusion, that's not, it goes beyond that. At some point, someone has to give up their seat for other people to progress. If you have a succession planning system, that's fine. You can do it in a kind of I suppose a more pedantic way. But if you're wanting to change the system quickly as possible, then people have to give up their seats. And in order to do that, there's a lot of people guarding their seats, their territories, so to speak. So how do we address that? That's one thing. If I look at it from an action point of view, or if I take it into the organization, for example, let's take project management. So if you have someone who's always in project management, who has that high visibility, always gets the resource allocation to them, gets the people with the right capabilities. What are you doing in order to change that equation? So how are you positioning people who might not be exposed to those high visibility projects? How are you helping them to move into that range? So it's really about breaking down the real structures and systems that and calling it out as you can. I mean, the one thing about speaking up that I will say is that it plays a tax on you, right? So it pays a tax on the person who's speaking up, and it pays a tax on the person who's listening. So we need to be conscious of the kinds of taxes that each of us carry and have to either accept or not going forward.
Thank you, Silvana. Really powerful. Just kind of thoughts there. Now, one of the things that a number of you have touched on, but I think it'd be good just to really get some specific tips here, and it's a bit of a follow-up question to the one I've just posed to you all, is how can we increase diversity at a board level? So one of the things that we're all aware of is that where we really see diversity dip is when we get to senior leadership and we get to organizational boards. So it'd be great just to hear from a couple of you your thoughts on how we can increase diversity at a board level. And I'd like to pose that question initially to you, please, Silvana. And then also, Shez, if you could please follow up with your thoughts on that after Silvana.
Okay, thanks, Grace. I mean, Rosemary and Kim touched on this before. It's about mirroring the population and mirroring the workforce. So, you know, if your talent management systems and your succession planning systems aren't equitable, then you need to leaders and architects of those systems need to make them more equitable. And it's not just about, it's time to give up calling up the business case. You know, racism isn't a business case, racism is an act. And we need to stop treating it as a business case. So how do we break down those racist impediments in our structures and so forth? And commit to targets and call, tie in performance measures to those boards accountable.
Thank you. Someone's dialed in called Q. Can I please ask you to place yourself on mute, please? There's quite a bit of background noise. Thank you. Sorry about that, Silvana. Was there anything you wanted to add, Silvana, or was your point complete?
No, thanks, I'm done.
Thank you. Shez, over to you, please, for your thoughts.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so why do we have a lack of diversity at board level in particular? Because it reflects the pyramid as you go up, and people from different minority backgrounds encounter all these glass ceilings. And it's a structural racism. So we tend to recruit in our own image from the networks we have. And they reflect who we are. So if we are more white males at the top of any pyramid and we want to find some directors for the board, we'll recruit people we know because we trust them. We know they're good. It's a good recruitment method, except that it's not, because it just puts more people like us into the directorships. So if we want to recruit people we know, and we want to recruit them to become directors, how can we do that? Well, we need to create conversations with people, a diverse group of people, different ethnic minority backgrounds, and we can't wait until we need them to become directors. So we need to create an ongoing, continuous relationship with a diverse group of talent with no specific objective at the time. We don't know why we want to talk to these people, but we know we need to talk to them to increase our network so that when positions come up at higher levels of the organisation and for the board of directors, we already know people who aren't reflective of our natural social networks or professional networks. And we've cultivated these diverse networks over time. And I think that's possibly a strategy we're maybe not, we're overlooking. And we're waiting until a position comes up and then looking around saying, well, why don't we know anyone who's diverse for this? Because we haven't put the groundwork in years ago. So I think that would be probably the strategy I'd suggest for now.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Shez, and thank you to all of the panelists for your thoughts so far. We're now going to take a look at some of the questions that have come through via Slido, but I'd also like to ask Pavlina, have we had any questions come through the chat?
In chat, we've mainly had just lots of really nice comments, just thanking the panelists and, and agreeing with what they've heard. We did have a question about maybe some specifics around how people challenge microaggressions, when they happen, especially at sort of different levels in the organization. Anything kind of practical the panelists can say about that. We haven't had any questions on Slido yet.
Okay, excellent. So that's good because I'm conscious of time anyway. Right. So just on the microaggression question, I'm actually going to go round to all of you, if you wouldn't mind. Kim, I'd like to start with you first of all, because I know you mentioned microaggressions before, and you mentioned, speaking up if you get a pay rise and maybe somebody within your organization or other people within your organization from a different background, maybe doing the same role, haven't received that, speaking up about that. But do you have any tips on how people do that?
Yeah, as Silvana said, there's a tax on you if you are brave enough to speak up, but it's so important to do that. So the way that I do it, and this may not be the best way, but it's the way I choose to do it, is if I hear something, I take that person to one side and say, perhaps you didn't mean to be racist when you said, and repeat them exactly what they said, but say that came across as racist. And if it's something like a microaggression, they might be entirely ignorant about this, but it's, an education exercise for people. So I think just, as I think Shaz said, it's not often done with like malicious intent, but just giving people an opportunity to kind of have a conversation with you about what they said as well.
Excellent, thank you. Shez, any thoughts from your experiences as well, because you're obviously quite outspoken. How would you recommend people approach addressing microaggressions that they observe or experience?
Yeah, look, I mean, I agree with Kim. This is about making a judgment, and these microaggressions are very common, and they're very often done unintentionally, and the approach is one of education. And so ditto what Kim said, but also I think it's part of the broader if you know these happen all the time, and they do because you experience them against yourself, and because you're an ethnic minority, you might be more sensitive to seeing them happen to other people. Then try and create the discussion, the open discussion in advance to put the term microaggression on people's radar can help. So that's one thing. But obviously, if you think it's intentional, or you think it's happening with such frequency from a particular person that it's tantamount to intent, then you're just going to have to challenge. You're just going to have to say, listen, I think you are engaging with some racist behaviours or some racist practices, and challenge them, and that can be difficult, and it really does depend on your position in the organisation, and as you say, that tax can be quite heavy sometimes. So you've got a decision to make based on those variables.
Absolutely. Silvana, you actually introduced the word tax into the conversation, and one of the things that a number of people on this call have probably experienced in their careers is being the person that speaks out against microaggressions, and subsequently being taxed when kind of promotions come up, or opportunities for projects and new opportunities as a result of speaking up. So what would your thoughts or recommendations be on just how we do that with a bit more conviction, but also an element of safety? Is there a way to speak up against microaggressions without being taxed?
No, unfortunately there isn't. I mean, I just have to call it as it is. I wouldn't, I wouldn't take people aside. I would call it out right there, because that's what anti-racism is. If you take people aside, it doesn't, for me anyway, it doesn't signal to others that this is right or this is wrong. Whereas if you call it out as it happens, then people around know what's right and they know what's wrong. But it takes a lot of courage, and you have to be in a very strong frame of mind to do that. You have to be quite centered, and also, and this is for me why I really homed in on leadership before. If the leaders can role model those behaviors, if they can create that, I know this is quite a overused word at the moment perhaps, but a psychologically safe environment, then it helps ease that tax somewhat. So I'd urge you all to go, and now I'm trying to remember who it is. Gosh, I can't remember. I'll come back. There's an organization, and it has a very, very flat structure, and everyone just speaks up whenever they can speak up to the CEO, they can speak up to anyone. And it will come back to me. Unfortunately, it's not a big organization. It's only about 400 or 500 people. So if we have an organization that's maybe 80,000 people, the hierarchy starts to take priority almost. But that's what that's what ultimately we're trying to encourage, is if someone has that courage to step up and say something, then it demonstrates to others that, look, we can also do this. But yes, usually the first or 2 or 3 people that do it are normally hit pretty badly. That's the reality, and we need to change. We need to change how we receive people who speak up. So the onus is not on the individual; it's on the collective.
Absolutely. Thank you, Silvana. Finally, Rosemary, your thoughts, any tips on how we call out racism or microaggressions that we observe?
Thank you. Really encouraged by what Silvana said. It's just hits all the right buttons for me. I do struggle with something that I hear often on my trip, that microaggressions are unintentional. And I struggle because I don't know how something that is aggressive can be unintentional. I don't go that way. I assume that if someone's engaged in that activity, it is very intentional. The nature of microaggression is to reduce, silence, and dispatch. That's the nature of it. And nobody does microaggression better than us Brits. You know, we take it to the next level. And it's something that has done a lot of damage, and we need to understand that. So microaggression is in no way, shape, or form unintentional, and tackling it and addressing it is a high stakes action. One thing that I encourage people to do is to, when they do address it, like Savannah said, in the moment, in the collective. In order to do that, you need to understand what it is you're looking at, which means you need to educate yourself as to what microaggressions do and can look like. You need to do that for yourself so that when you come to a space, you hear it, you can smell it, you can taste the subtleties of it. One tool that I have given to people is a tool of definition. So in a collective space, like I say, when you said X, Y, and Z, I heard A, B, and C. Is that what you meant? In that space, you've not accused somebody of saying what they said was racist or whatever, because that sometimes shuts things down and then creates feathers and fur, and then it goes into another conversation which is not helpful to the space. But if you signal to somebody in a subtle way, this is what I heard, is that what you meant? And very often say, oh, no, I meant so and so and so and so. The outcome of what you said has the danger of, or the potential to, silence, put down, derail. Someone said, is that your intention? It's a meeting, someone's taking minutes, right? They have to say, yes, that's my intention, or no, that's not my intention. But they have to say it in that space. And it's respectful. It's a question. I was raised like many of you. There's nothing wrong with a question. You just need to know how to ask it. And in that sense, you set a tone that people can't just throw out words and phrases and attitudes with negligently. And if you are able to challenge it pointedly and constructively by asking a question, it's really, it has the potential of galvanizing someone as, oh, I can do that? I can ask that? Yeah, you can, in a way that holds everybody in that space accountable. Sometimes the microaggressions are one-on-one. And that can be a little bit more intense. When those who feel it, know it. And I say to people, don't second guess yourself, because you are a human like everyone else. If you feel uncomfortable by what was said to you or in your presence or whatever, and it made you go, ooh, trust that and ask the question. What exactly do you mean by that? This is what I heard. Is that what you meant? And it creates, it puts the weight in the center there. And then rather than you take it home with you, it's there so that they have to think about, okay, this is what I said and this is how I meant it. And if it is something that they didn't mean for it to come out that way, it's maybe they're tired, or it's the way that everyone in their social circles speak or whatever. That's the place, that's the point, to explain yourself rather than put it on the person who has to receive that to then take it home and say, it's not really worth me putting my head above the parapet or trying to progress within this organisation, because this will always happen.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Rosemary. And thank you so much to all of you, Shez, Kim, Silvana, and Rosemary, of course. You have given us, without a doubt, some amazing pieces of your knowledge and your experience, but also some real thoughts to go away. And I'd like to think as well, some actions to take away really as well, whether that be educating ourselves, whether that be having those uncomfortable conversations, or whether that be creating the space for them, you know, creating, and I know we use that, you know, like Silvana said, we use the term safe space quite a lot. But I think it's really important for us to have those safe spaces for those conversations. So I'm really hoping you got a lot out of this panel discussion. I'm so grateful to everyone that's taken the time to join. I'm of course so grateful to our panelists. We've been working on this for a good few weeks, and you've all been fantastic in just being so supportive and just really sharing your thoughts and helping me to pull this together, and the team that are supporting with this session as well. So I'd like to thank Pavlina and Lauren, as well as Heidi, for joining today to support with making this a success. I'm conscious that some questions may have come through slightly later, so just to give you comfort that we will answer as many of those questions as we can in the write-up for you. And we hope to be able to do panel discussions on these, you know, on similar topics in the coming years, and to really keep this as something that is a continuing conversation, as opposed to something that can sometimes be seen as being seasonal. So thank you to everyone for joining, and please do have a lovely week. Take care.